From Columbus to Constitution, the 284-year foundation that built America's post-WWII dominance. Most people think American superpower status arrived suddenly in 1945, the moment Japan surrendered, but that belief is incomplete. The real story is that America had been preparing for global dominance since 1491, long before anyone knew there would be a Cold War. And the reason the Soviet Union lost isn't because of Reagan's military spending or American technology alone, it's because America had already won the competition before the Iron Curtain ever fell. Before we continue, if you lived through any part of the Cold War, I want to hear from you in the comments. What was the moment when you realized America and the Soviet Union weren't friends anymore? Was it something you saw on the news, or something someone told you? Share it down below. And if this kind of deep historical context interests you, our complete guide to the ideological roots of American supremacy goes much further. It's available in the description and pinned comment. That guide walks you through the mechanisms that separated American expansion from European colonialism, and why those differences mattered when the Cold War actually began. Columbus didn't just sail west. What he initiated was a model of settlement so structurally different from what Spain, Portugal, and France were doing that it eventually rewired how power itself moved across continents. Spain built extraction colonies. You take the gold, you take the people, you govern from Madrid. England built something else. The Virginia Company and later proprietors created settlements designed to be self-reproducing. They needed families, they needed yeoman farmers, they needed towns, not just fortresses and mines. This wasn't idealism, it was capitalist efficiency. A self-sustaining population grows your tax base. It produces soldiers without you having to ship them across the Atlantic. It reproduces itself. By the early 1700s, the 13 colonies had accumulated something no other colonial power in the Western Hemisphere had. A genuinely distributed base of economic and social power that didn't depend on a single crown or capital. Wait, I need to be precise here. This matters because it changed everything. The Spanish colonies made money faster. They had more silver. They had more land. On any given year from 1600 to 1750, Spain's colonial wealth dwarfed England's. But Spain's colonies were brittle. Money flowed upward to the crown. Power stayed in Madrid. When America eventually rebelled, the Spanish colonies couldn't do it effectively because they had no tradition of self-governance, no merchant class with independent capital, no network of towns that could coordinate without the crown. Spain lost its colonies. Britain lost 13 colonies, but those 13 colonies could govern themselves immediately, and did. By 1776, the American experiment was already a decentralized federation of functioning economic units, with no peer in the colonial world. The Constitution didn't create that, it systematized it. And here is what historians often miss. The Constitution was not designed to create equality or democratic purity. It was designed to protect property and distribute power widely enough that no single faction could monopolize it. That meant merchants in Boston could compete with plantation owners in Virginia. Manufacturers in Pennsylvania could resist farmers from Georgia. No king lived at the top. Power was distributed, constantly contested. That distributed contestation became America's actual superpower. The French built the world's most powerful state. Centralized, beautiful, intellectually coherent. Napoleon nearly conquered Europe, and then collapsed. Russia under the Tsars built autocratic power that lasted centuries. China maintained imperial unity for 2,000 years. But something about the American system, messy, fractious, expensive to manage, survived wars, civil conflict, industrial transformation, and depression where every other model cracked. This is the secret I need you to understand as we move forward. America didn't dominate the world because it was morally superior. It dominated because it had a system that could tolerate distributed power. That system could absorb new populations, new industries, new ideas, and keep functioning. Rome had this quality too for a while. Britain had it during the Industrial Revolution, but neither lasted because neither could adapt fast enough to economic transformation. America's founders, and frankly, they were lucky to include exactly the people they did, created something that forced adaptation. They made it nearly impossible for one group to consolidate permanent control. They made it painful to change the system, but possible. That sounds like a weakness. It was America's greatest strength. When America faced its first genuine crisis, the Civil War, the system nearly broke. 50 years later, it had not just recovered, but had built an industrial economy that exceeded Britain's in total output. That was 1890. 30 years after that, America entered World War I as a fresh, wealthy power. When World War II came, America's economy had already been tested by the Depression and was rising again. The Soviet Union, by contrast, industrialized by command. Faster in some ways, brutally efficient at mobilizing resources for specific goals. But it never developed that capacity for distributed contestation. Power remained concentrated at the center. Initiative had to come from the top. When the system needed to adapt, when it needed new industries, new ideas, flexibility in response to changing circumstances, there was no mechanism for it. By 1945, this wasn't yet obvious. The Soviets had defeated Hitler. They occupied half of Europe. America had the bomb, but so would Stalin soon enough. From the outside, these looked like two peer competitors preparing for confrontation. They weren't. One had 284 years of practice making distributed power work. The other had centralized control perfected to an art. The Cold War was always going to pit these two models against each other, but the outcome was never actually in doubt. The irony is that Stalin knew this. Not consciously, perhaps, not in the way a modern economist might frame it, but he felt the vulnerability. He understood that the Soviet system, for all its military power, lacked something fundamental: flexibility, redundancy, the ability to fail in small ways without the entire structure collapsing. So Stalin did what any threatened leader does. He doubled down on control. After 1945, he tightened his grip on Eastern Europe. He demanded absolute loyalty from satellite states. He expanded the secret police. He collectivized agriculture even more ruthlessly than before. Every deviation from the plan became not just an error, but a betrayal. This worked, for a time. Fear is a powerful organizing principle. It keeps people in line. It makes them work harder, move faster, follow orders without question. For the first decade of the Cold War, the Soviet Union could match America in almost every measurable way: military spending, weapons production, technological innovation. On paper, they looked like equals. But on paper is where the equality ended. By the early 1950s, American consumers had choices, not just of which car to buy, but which brand of milk, which cut of meat, which restaurant to eat in. Soviet citizens waited in lines, long ones, for bread, for shoes, for anything that wasn't officially rationed. The system could produce tanks. It struggled to produce socks. These weren't glamorous problems. They didn't appear in military intelligence reports. No general filed a report saying, "The Soviets will eventually lose because they cannot supply their population with adequate underwear." And yet that's precisely what happened. The system that had survived total war, that had industrialized from scratch in a single generation, that had built an atomic bomb through sheer will and sacrifice, that system could not answer a simple question: what do ordinary people actually need? Khrushchev understood this better than Stalin did. When Stalin died in 1953, Khrushchev eventually took control. He was a different kind of leader, less ideological, more pragmatic. He visited America. He saw what abundance looked like, and he tried to adapt the Soviet model to compete with it. He launched Virgin Lands, a massive agricultural initiative to expand grain production across Central Asia. The idea was sound. The execution was characteristic of the system: too fast, too centralized, too confident that the plan would work simply because Moscow had decided it. Within a few years, the soil was degraded. Dust storms began. Harvests collapsed. By the late 1950s, the Soviet Union, the world's largest country by geography, was importing grain, importing it from the West. This was the crack in the foundation, not a moral crack, not a political one, exactly, a practical one. The system that claimed to have solved the fundamental problems of capitalism, poverty, scarcity, inequality, could not feed its own people without buying food from the capitalist world. Before we continue, I need you to lock something into place. This part of the story is where the outcome of the entire Cold War was actually decided. Not in Cuba, not in Vietnam, not in any of the confrontations that made the headlines. The verdict was rendered in the gap between what people needed and what the system could provide. That's the mechanism that no ideology can override, no military buildup can compensate for, no propaganda can disguise forever. If you want to understand not just what happened during the Cold War, but why it happened, the actual structural reasons, the signals that historians now recognize in hindsight, our complete guide on this era's foundations and trajectories is in the description and pinned in the comments. It walks through the economic, agricultural, and logistical mechanisms that shaped every decision, from Korea to the missile crisis to détente. This isn't surface-level summary. It goes into the actual systems. Khrushchev tried to fix it. In 1956, he denounced Stalin's crimes at the 20th Party Congress. A secret speech. Hundreds of communist leaders sat in the hall and heard the leader of the communist world admit that the previous leader had been a murderer. Word leaked out. It shook the faith of communists everywhere. Some left the party. Others stayed but lost their certainty. Then came Hungary. In October 1956, students in Budapest rose up against Soviet control. They wanted Hungarian independence. They wanted democracy. For a brief moment, it looked like the Soviet Empire might actually fracture. Khrushchev ordered tanks into Budapest. Thousands died. The uprising was crushed. The message was clear. The Soviet Union would not allow its satellites to escape, no matter what Moscow had just admitted about its own past crimes. This was the contradiction at the heart of Soviet power. Reform the system, and you risk losing control. Maintain control, and you ensure the system will eventually fail from its own internal contradictions. There was no path through, only a choice between different kinds of slow collapse. America, by contrast, faced no such dilemma. Its system could reform. It could adapt. Eisenhower won the presidency in 1952, partly because he promised to wind down the Korean War, and he did. The fighting stopped in 1953. The war didn't end. It remains technically unresolved, but the active combat ceased. American soldiers came home. This flexibility cost America nothing. The war was unpopular, so it ended. The public wanted interstate highways, so Eisenhower built them. Businesses wanted to expand, so regulations stayed light. When one approach didn't work, another was tried. Failure didn't require admitting that the entire system was rotten. That flexibility shaped everything that came next. The 1950s saw American economic dominance reach a level that would never be matched again. Gross domestic product grew by nearly 50% in a single decade. Real wages for industrial workers climbed steadily. Home ownership became the defining achievement of the middle class, and the government made that possible. Tax incentives, FHA loans, highway construction that connected suburbs to city jobs. A family could actually build a future. The Soviet Union watched this. Khrushchev saw American consumer goods flooding markets that Moscow could not reach. He saw housing shortages in Soviet cities while Americans built suburban homes almost casually. He saw the gap widening, and he understood what it meant. Economic stagnation corroded legitimacy. When people cannot buy bread, they do not care about ideology. Yet Khrushchev pushed reform anyway. He released political prisoners. He denounced Stalin's crimes publicly. He allowed some limited private farming. He even permitted limited cultural expression. Soviet poets could publish. Soviet films could be shown. The thaw, as it was called, was real, but it was also terrifying to the Communist Party apparatus. Open the system slightly, and people want more. Give an inch, and the pressure demands a mile. In 1956, that pressure exploded. Hungary rebelled. Students and workers demanded genuine independence from Moscow, not just rhetoric about Polish or Hungarian sovereignty. Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest. Thousands died. The Hungarian Revolution lasted 2 weeks before Soviet armor crushed it completely. Khrushchev faced a choice at that moment. The Hungarian Revolution proved that reform breeds instability. Every crack in the system invites upheaval. Tighten control, and you prevent rebellion. But then you are back to Stalinist methods. You are back to admitting that the communist system cannot survive unless people fear it. Before we continue, hold this in mind for a moment. The Cold War was not just a military struggle or an ideological contest. It was a structural problem built into how the two superpowers functioned. America could accommodate change. The Soviet system could not. And that difference would eventually determine which system survived. If you want to understand why Soviet communism collapsed and America emerged intact, you need to see how deeply this ran. The mechanisms behind this, the specific choices and miscalculations that turned structural weakness into actual collapse, those are laid out in full in our complete guide, which you can find in the description and the pinned comment. It goes much deeper than what I can cover here. Hungary's defeat settled something psychologically in Moscow. Reform was dangerous. Control had to be absolute. Khrushchev still allowed some cultural openness, some limited economic experimentation, but the doors were closed on genuine systemic change. The Communist Party would govern. The people would obey. There was no middle ground. America saw this clearly. American intelligence, still relatively new to the game of espionage, understood what had happened. The Soviet system required fear. It could not accommodate pluralism. Over time, this meant it could not compete with a system that did accommodate change. But immediate competition was still brutal. The Soviets launched Sputnik in 1957, the first artificial satellite. Americans were shocked. The technology seemed impossibly advanced. If the Soviets could put a satellite in orbit, could they put a nuclear warhead on a missile aimed at America? The fear was visceral. This was the moment when space became strategic, not just scientifically, but militarily and politically. Whoever controlled space might control the future. President Eisenhower understood this immediately. He authorized the creation of NASA in 1958. The space race was not really about reaching the moon. It was about demonstrating technological superiority. It was about proving that the American system, democratic, capitalist, free, could out-innovate the Soviet system. It was about showing the world that freedom produces achievement. NASA was born from fear, real fear. American scientists had assumed they were ahead in rocketry. They were wrong. Werner von Braun, the German engineer who had worked on Nazi missiles and was now working for the Americans, warned Eisenhower that the Soviets were not behind. They were ahead. The gap was not theoretical. It was measurable. It was urgent. By 1961, John F. Kennedy took office. He inherited this crisis. The Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin had orbited Earth on April 12, 1961. Kennedy read the newspaper like every American read it. Humiliation. The first human in space was Soviet. Within weeks, Kennedy made a decision that would define his presidency. He committed America to landing a man on the moon before 1970. Not because it was easy, because it was hard, because it was visible, because the whole world would see it. This was not just science. It was theater. It was propaganda. It was survival. The race consumed resources. NASA's budget swelled from roughly $500 million in 1960 to nearly $5.4 billion by 1966. That was about 4% of the entire federal budget. Thousands of engineers, mathematicians, and technicians were mobilized. Universities received contracts. Industries were transformed. The goal was singular: beat the Soviets to the moon. Meanwhile, the Soviets were not idle. They too wanted the moon. They had their own program, their own timeline. What Americans did not know then, but historians understand now, is that the Soviet program was fragmented. Multiple design bureaus competed with each other rather than coordinating. Sergei Korolev, the brilliant chief designer of the Soviet space program, was politically sidelined by rivals. He died unexpectedly in 1966 during surgery. The momentum was lost. The program fractured further. America did not know this advantage. They could only see the Soviet achievements. They could only fear falling behind. That fear drove them forward. Hold on. Before we continue, I want to mark something important. The space race appears in every Cold War history as a competition between two systems. But what it really reveals is how technological progress becomes weaponized during ideological conflict. The same rockets that carried cosmonauts to orbit could carry nuclear weapons. Kennedy and Khrushchev both understood this. The space program was not separate from the nuclear arsenal. It was an extension of it. The technologies were parallel. The stakes were identical. If you want to understand how this competition shaped everything from missile defense to satellite surveillance to the computer revolution itself, our complete guide on Cold War technology and strategy goes much deeper into these mechanisms. You'll find it in the description and pinned in the comments. It walks through the declassified intelligence reports and engineering decisions, that show how civilian and military space programs were always intertwined. By July 1969, Apollo 11 landed on the Moon. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on its surface. Michael Collins orbited above them. The entire world watched. In the Soviet Union, the state media acknowledged the American achievement, but muted. In America, the triumph was complete. The space program had delivered on Kennedy's promise, though Kennedy himself had been assassinated in 1963 and would never see it. The technological leap was genuine. The engineering was extraordinary. American innovation had proven itself. The free market system, combined with government investment and a clear goal, had produced something unprecedented. But the symbolic victory mattered more. In the calculus of the Cold War, image was policy, perception was power. This moment would be remembered. It would be taught in schools. It would define a generation's understanding of American capability. The space race had been won. The psychological impact rippled outward for decades. But here is where the narrative shifts. The moon landing had proven American technological and organizational superiority. It had quieted doubts at home, yet it changed nothing about the nuclear stalemate. Both superpowers still possessed enough weapons to destroy each other dozens of times over. Neither could afford a direct confrontation. Both knew it. By 1970, a new word entered diplomatic vocabulary: détente. It meant a relaxation of tensions. In practice, it meant something far more calculated than simple peace. It meant managing competition. It meant accepting that the Soviet Union would remain, would expand its influence in certain regions, and that the United States could not prevent this without risking everything. It also meant that Soviet leaders had come to the same conclusion about American power. The Vietnam War was ending, though not yet concluded. American forces had begun withdrawing in 1969. The war had shattered the national consensus that had held since 1945. It had killed nearly 60,000 Americans and over 1 million Vietnamese. It had turned universities into battlegrounds. Families had split. Trust in government had fractured. By 1973, the last American combat troops would leave Vietnam. By 1975, North Vietnam would take the South. The domino theory, which had driven American policy for 2 decades, had failed. Communism had triumphed in Southeast Asia, and America had to live with that outcome. This is the paradox of détente. It was born from defeat, not strength. American leaders could not prevent Soviet expansion in the Third World. They could only acknowledge the limits of their power and try to manage the competition through negotiation and arms control. In 1972, President Nixon traveled to Moscow, the first American president to visit the Soviet Union since before the war. He and Brezhnev signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or SALT-INE. It did not reduce nuclear weapons, it merely capped the number each side could build. Both nations could still annihilate civilization, but at least they had agreed that more weapons would not make anyone safer. Paradoxically, accepting mutual vulnerability had created a kind of stability. Wait, before we continue further, I need to make sure you're tracking the deeper mechanism at work here. Détente was not a truce between ideological enemies. It was a negotiated acceptance that both systems would endure and that their competition would be managed through rules. Those rules were spelled out in the full historical guide to this era, available in the description and pinned comment. That guide walks you through the precise treaties, the negotiating positions, and the strategic calculations that made détente work for over a decade. It is where the intricate signals between Moscow and Washington are fully explained and contextualized. If you want to understand how superpowers actually manage existential rivalry, that deeper dive is essential. The arms race continued, even as negotiations proceeded. American defense spending dropped in the early 1970s, the only period of sustained decline during the entire Cold War. The Strategic Air Command, the bomber forces, the missile submarines, all operated on smaller budgets. Meanwhile, Soviet military spending increased. The Russians were building newer missiles, larger submarines, expanding their conventional forces. American strategists watched this unfold with growing alarm. The Soviet Union was catching up. By 1975 or so, rough parity would be achieved in strategic nuclear weapons. The Americans would no longer have overwhelming superiority. The balance of terror would be truly balanced. In the Middle East, American and Soviet interests collided once more. The 1973 Yom Kippur War between Israel and its Arab neighbors brought Soviet-armed Egypt and Syria against the American-backed Israelis. Both superpowers resupplied their clients during the conflict. The tension spiked briefly. Nuclear alerts were called. Then the war ended. Détente survived. But the narrowness of the escape was unsettling to everyone involved. The Helsinki Accords of 1975 represented the high watermark of détente. Signed by 35 nations, including the United States and the Soviet Union, these accords acknowledged the post-war borders in Europe, accepting, in effect, Soviet control of Eastern Europe. In return, the Soviet Union committed, at least on paper, to respecting human rights and allowing freedom of movement. Of course, they would violate these provisions almost immediately. Soviet dissidents would continue to be arrested. The promise meant little in practice. Yet symbolically, this was the moment when the Cold War seemed to be stabilizing into a permanent order. The world had learned to live with division. And yet the very permanence that Helsinki promised became its vulnerability. The accords were built on a single, fragile assumption that both superpowers could manage their competition through negotiation, that spheres of influence could be respected, that détente was not weakness but simply realism. The Soviet leadership believed this. The American leadership hoped for it. But neither side had reckoned with what happens when the rules of competition change in ways neither can control. In December 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. It was not a miscalculation or a regional power play. It was a statement that détente had limits. The Kremlin faced a collapsing communist government in Kabul and a rising tide of Islamic resistance. They chose to send 80,000 troops and install a puppet regime. The American response was swift and unambiguous. President Jimmy Carter withdrew from the Post-WWII treaty negotiations, imposed grain embargoes, and called for a massive arms buildup. The era of managed competition was over. Détente, which had lasted barely a decade, was dead. What followed was the most dangerous period of the entire Cold War. Not in terms of military engagement, Vietnam had been bloodier, the Cuban Missile Crisis more acute, but in terms of sheer existential dread, the 1980s surpassed everything that came before. Ronald Reagan entered the White House in 1981 with a conviction that détente had been a mistake, that the Soviet Union was an evil empire in terminal decline, and that America could accelerate that decline through military pressure. He was right about the decay. He was right about the pressure. What no one knew was how close to collapse the Soviet system actually was, and how dangerous a wounded empire can become. Reagan approved the Strategic Defense Initiative, a space-based missile defense system that threatened the very foundation of Soviet nuclear strategy. He authorized covert support for Islamic fighters in Afghanistan, the Contras in Nicaragua, and anti-communist movements across the Third World. American military spending surged from roughly $130 billion annually in 1980 to over $300 billion by 1988. The nuclear arsenals grew. The rhetoric hardened. For the first time since the Cuban Missile Crisis, Americans could feel the genuine possibility of nuclear war. Children practiced duck and cover drills again. Civil defense shelters were discussed in earnest. The fear was not irrational. It was earned. And this brings me to the revelation I promised you at the beginning. Remember when I said that understanding the 284 years from Columbus to the Constitution explained why America emerged dominant after 1945? The reason is not what you think it is. It is not because Americans were smarter, or more unified, or more militarily capable. It is because by the time the Cold War reached its final, most dangerous phase, the American system had already developed something the Soviet Union could never replicate: the ability to absorb shock without breaking, the ability to survive ideological crisis, political turmoil, economic challenge, and still adapt. The Soviet Union in the 1980s was brittle. Its economy was stagnant, its ideology was exhausted, its technology was falling behind, its people knew it. When the pressure from the Reagan buildup came, there was nothing flexible to absorb it. The system could not reform without admitting failure. It could not reform without loosening control. And once control loosened, the entire apparatus began to crack. By 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev arrived in power with glasnost and perestroika, openness and restructuring. He hoped to save communism by reforming it. Instead, he destroyed it. The Berlin Wall fell in November 1989. Not because America defeated the Soviet Union in some final military confrontation, but because the Soviet system no longer had the will or the capacity to hold it up. The wall came down because an entire empire had finally exhausted itself, and a younger generation refused to accept the division their parents had lived with for 4 decades. Americans watched on television as Germans danced on the rubble of concrete and barbed wire. The Cold War was over. The world would never be the same. Here is what you should take from all of this. The foundation that began with Columbus, strengthened through the Constitution, and carried through 2 centuries of American growth, did not guarantee victory in the Cold War, but it made America resilient in ways that rigid empires could never be. When you live in a system where dissent is allowed, where power must be negotiated, where change is constant and often messy, you develop a kind of institutional flexibility. You learn to absorb shocks. You survive things that would break more brittle systems. That is the real lesson of the 284 years that led to 1945, and the 44 years that followed. This week, think about a time when you had to adapt to something you did not expect. Notice how you did it. That flexibility, that willingness to change without losing your core, that is what made America win the Cold War. Thank you for watching. If this historical clarity resonates with you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss when we upload. And please, leave a comment, I read them, telling me which decade of the Cold War you lived through and what surprised you most about the full story now that you have seen it. The conversation in the comments is where the real understanding happens. Thank you.